ClancyPasta presents My Daughter's Nightmares Keep Coming True. I think we are both in danger. Written by Daphne O. Did It. Last week, my daughter, 5, crawled into bed with me in the middle of the night claiming that she'd had a nightmare. I was not especially concerned, since this had happened several times before, and she usually quickly fell asleep again, forgetting the nightmare by the next morning. So I let her get in with me, expecting her to calm down and drift off, but I could feel her little heart was beating fast, and her eyes were wide open with terror in the darkness. I asked her to describe the dream she had been having so that I could reassure her that the nightmare hadn't been real. She explained how she had dreamt that the neighbor's pet rabbit had been mauled by a fox. An odd dream for her to have, considering that she had hardly even seen the neighbor's rabbit, and nothing could have prompted this dream. As far as I knew, the neighbor's rabbit was alive and well in its hutch. I was more disturbed when she described how the rabbit had been ripped apart by the fox. I thought that this was a disturbing dream for her to have had, and that perhaps she had seen some kind of nature show on TV about predators and prey. I resolved to be more careful about what I watched around my daughter. In any case, I could see how her dream was traumatic. The next morning I had completely forgotten about my daughter's dream until I took the bins out. My neighbor was in the front yard too, and we made polite small talk over the fence. I asked him how he was doing, and he confessed that he was having a nightmare of a day after he had found the mauled body of his children's rabbit eaten by foxes in the night, he explained. He explained the bloody and traumatic scene that he had cleared up. The memory of my daughter's nightmare from the previous night sent trickles of ice down my spine. Had she heard the sounds of the rabbit being killed? Was the dream a coincidence? It seemed too strange to be true that her nightmare had occurred the very morning after she had dreamt it. I knew for certain that I would not mention the rabbit being killed to my daughter, and asked my neighbor not to either, in case he saw her. I expressed my sympathy for the rabbit and rushed back inside. The next night, my daughter's little silhouette appeared at my door again as she crawled into bed with me, letting me know in a small voice that she had another nightmare. I felt a sinking feeling in the pit of my stomach as I asked what it had been about this time. Little hands shaking around mine, she recounted how a lady was being hurt by some men in something behind a street. I tried to get her to tell me where she dreamt this had happened, keeping my voice gentle so as not to scare her, but she didn't know. She fell asleep after watching a cartoon on the iPad for a little while, something I rarely let my daughter do in the night, but she was very shaken up, and so was I. I had a look on some parenting websites and Reddit about disturbing dreams and night terrors in young children, but found that they were usually triggered by a traumatic event or experience. This definitely isn't the case for Sadie, my daughter, since we've been in quarantine for over 3 months, so she has been with me almost all the time. I eventually fell asleep too. However, the next morning I was sickened to read an article about a woman being assaulted and beaten unconscious in an alley in our nearest city. As you can imagine, I was extremely uneasy at this, and asked Sadie casually in a falsely light tone to describe the dream again in detail while I was making breakfast. She told me about a small woman with short, dark hair. I almost dropped the carton of milk I was holding, since the description matched the picture of the dark-haired, petite picture of the victim from the article exactly. The next night passed uneventfully, my sleep uninterrupted by any reports of nightmares from Sadie, and I vainly hoped that that would be the last of the prophetic nightmares. However, when on Thursday night Sadie appeared by my bed, shaking me awake to recount to me that night's nightmare, I listened, silent and still, as she explained the horrific dream. She was not especially articulate at describing the scene, whispering fragmented sentences like fire and black clouds, a man hurt on the floor. However, I got the gist of the nightmare. Fire, black clouds of billowing smoke, beams of wood falling, people running and choking, tongues of flame blocking an exit. The scene she painted was horrific. I was horrified, laying awake for hours, obsessively refreshing my local newsfeed for any mention of a house fire. There was none. By the time the sky was lightening behind the curtains, my eyelids had begun to get heavy. After hours without any reports of a fire, I had managed to calm myself enough to realize that I hadn't been thinking rationally. With the pale morning light pouring in on Sadie's still form sleeping peacefully next to me, the nightmares seemed little more than an unnerving coincidence. I resolved to have Sadie talk to a dream analyst or sleep counselor specializing in children, and perhaps find one who could do a Zoom call with us while we were still in lockdown as I drifted off to sleep myself. The next morning, however, I opened a group chat with my friends to find that the topic of discussion was a raging house fire just down the street from one of my childhood friends. A family home was still ablaze as firefighters tried valiantly to rescue the inhabitants from the burning house. One man was badly injured and had been hospitalized after being trapped under a falling beam. On Friday night, my daughter slept in my bed from the start. I didn't object. I barely slept at all, waiting for Sadie to wake up and predict yet another prophetic atrocity that was sure to come true. Was I being ridiculous? Was lockdown making me paranoid? I knew my fears were irrational, yet I couldn't sleep. Sadie woke with a jolt at around 2 a.m. I prepared myself for the worst. However, this time the nightmare was downright confusing. I asked her to repeat herself, feeling sure she was getting her words confused, but she was adamant in her recollection of the story. Auntie Susan was hitting Uncle Colin. She was shouting at him and throwing plates at him and smashing them on the floor. She had made his arm bleed. For the first time, I felt completely certain when I reassured my daughter that it was just a nightmare and wasn't real. My brother Colin was in a happy relationship with his wife Susan. They had been married for 3 years now and had shown no signs of being nothing but adoring of one another. The dream was unsettling, however, and the next day I dropped by Susan and Colin's house unannounced with a contrived intention of dropping off some things that my brother had left at our house before lockdown. Sadie trailed along next to me as I walked up to the door, her shoulders slumped. The dreams were getting to her. Of course, she had no idea that the horrific nightmares were coming true, but the details that she recounted were horrific enough to put anyone on edge, especially a 5-year-old. I thought that seeing my brother well and happy would at least reassure her that last night's dream was nothing more than her imagination. When my brother opened the door with a bandaged face and hand, one of his eyes blackened, I knew I had been very wrong. Sadie barely spoke for the rest of that day, although my brother's injured state did not seem to surprise her in the slightest. That night around 8 p.m., she began to cry as bedtime approached, and she was terrified of going to sleep in anticipation of the horrific nightmares. I wasn't thrilled by the idea either. Sadie's prophetic nightmares had put me on edge, and 4 times the dreams had been uncannily accurate. As she ate her dinner, her hands shook and her lip quivered, more pale and tired than I'd ever seen her. The sleep deprivation was getting to me too. I had barely slept for several nights, and I was beginning to feel jumpy and on edge myself. My vision swimming and my limbs quite literally exhausted. My body was screaming for decent sleep, but my mind was in a state of heightened alertness. I heard noises in our dark little house as I did the washing up, creaking floorboards in the kitchen that caused me to spin around and be faced with nothing but our dimly lit downstairs. I also felt the ever-growing sense that something was watching me as I crossed the dark living room, careful not to look at the inky abyss which was the open basement door. I practically sprinted up the stairs, secretly glad that I wouldn't be sleeping alone, since Sadie was tucked up in my bed on the iPad already. I felt that I was going crazy, putting far too much significance on the nightmares of a 5-year-old. I needed to get a grip. I hadn't felt this paranoid living alone for years. Being the only adult in the house was turning me into a child, I told myself sternly. Exhausted, Sadie crashed out almost straight away, and I followed her pretty quickly. However, at 2 a.m., I felt her clammy little hand shaking me awake yet again. "Tell me," I whispered, my stomach turning to ice. Tears threatened to spill from Sadie's eyes. "There was a man in our basement," she whimpered. "He crept up the stairs and waited in the dark for us to come out." My hands went rigid around hers. "He was holding a knife and... Her speech was barely audible as she looked up at me, wide-eyed. "He heard us, Mommy. He heard us." Thanks for watching, and I hope you enjoyed today's video. I want to give a huge thanks to all of my supporters over at Patreon and YouTube memberships. Your support makes these narrations possible, and I appreciate it a ton. If you'd like to join these lovely ghouls, you can head on over to my Patreon at patreon.com/ClancyPasta, or click the join button below to become a member. And if you'd like creepy cool shirts, make sure to head on over and check out my official merch store for some awesome tees, hoodies, stickers, and more. Alright. Thank you all for watching, and I hope you have a great night. Cheers.